My guest today is Chris Townsend, the Vice President of U.S. Public Sector Sales at Elastic. Chris, always a pleasure to catch up. Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Jason. I think it's been a couple of years or so thank you for having me back on. I appreciate it.
Well, there's a lot to catch up on, especially what you're doing at Elastic. But let me first set a little context for our discussion today. June was the 4-year anniversary of the Federal Data Strategy. It's clear just how much progress agencies have made since OMB released that initial vision. Each agency has a chief data officer. They have their own data strategies for the most part. Governance and frameworks have been taking shape over the last few years. Agencies are starting to see that impact of the work. And the Federal Data Strategy calls for agencies to use data to drive decisions or operationalize their data. All of that is starting to come into focus. And when you add the advancements of artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, having the right data at the right time, ensuring it's accessible by the right people, that becomes more important than ever. The IT Innovation Foundation found in a report from last June that agencies need help to advance their maturity model outlined in a 2021 update to the Federal Data Strategy. ITIF says agencies still need a lot of help to better understand which tools and techniques are most appropriate for them and their customers, and how to prioritize data insights that are most important for their own missions. For some of those solutions to those big challenges, Chris Townsend, the Vice President of U.S. Public Sector Sales at Elastic, you're going to tell us how they're going to do that in 15 words or less. But let's just start with data scale. We know it's a big issue. How are agencies starting to break down these data silos that have built up over the years?
Yeah, in your introduction, Jason, you hit the nail on the head, right? Our public sector agencies are trying to understand how to best operationalize their data to support their mission needs and drive better outcomes for their agencies, whether that's to more effectively deliver healthcare, process claims, do fraud detection, better enable the warfighter. In the state and local realm, we're doing a lot of really cool stuff around law enforcement and at the university. So everyone is trying to understand how to operationalize their data and do it the most efficiently and most cost effectively as possible. And as you mentioned, silos is a huge challenge, right? Especially in public sector because of the scale at which our customers operate. They have data that's in multiple clouds, right? There's data in GCP and AWS and Azure. There's data on-prem. There's unstructured data. There's structured data. And how do they effectively operationalize that data across all those silos? And if you look at some large agencies that have individual organizations within that agency, each of those agencies, those sub-agencies have their own data stores as well, and they're not easily accessible at the head end. So being able to operationalize data at scale and across all of these multiple silos is a real challenge, and one of the areas that at Elastic we really thrive at. It really differentiates what we do at Elastic. And to put it in the most simplest terms, we're able to take search to the data rather than bring the data to search. And what I mean by that is, the thinking for a long time is, hey, we have to bring all this data back to a common data store or a centralized location, a data warehouse or a data lake, and search it in that way. And that's just not practical for a lot of our large, complex public sector customers. You hear the DoD talk a lot now about their data mesh strategy, right? And the idea of data mesh is, again, to be able to take the analytics and the search to the data where the data resides and all these different silos, and then bring just the relevant information back, the results back to a centralized location. And that's why, if you look at CIS's decision to standardize on Elastic on the CDM dashboard, for example, you have 200 disparate agencies, that you want to be able to do that data analysis at those agencies and just bring the relevant information back to the CDM dashboard, and we're able to do that. And that's why we're deployed at scale. And if you look at the JRSS dashboard or the Army, for the first time, the Army has brought together its strategic and tactical environment under a unified SIM architecture. Again, that's powered by Elastic because of our ability to work across those very complex silos.
The concept that you laid out, bring the search to the data, not the data to the search. And I think for so long, I think that's been the problem with search. Right. You go to any agency website and it's try to search something. Maybe delve into that a little bit more about how that works, because the idea is if you have this data lake and you're bringing the tools into the lake, you could be spending hours dredging the lake and not
right.
finding the dead body, the data you want.
Right, exactly. So yeah, there was an idea for a long time that, hey, you have to duplicate all of your data, and then what you're doing is running multiple tools on these. Essentially, you're taking all of your data, duplicating it in a number of instances, and then running separate tools on that data. So essentially, you're paying to access your data from a compute standpoint, from a software standpoint, multiple times, and it's just not scalable. So one of the unique things we do at Elastic is called cross-cluster search. And essentially, we have small clusters that we can put out in an Amazon environment, in a GCP environment, in an Azure environment, in an on-prem environment, and query those clusters and just bring the results back to a centralized location rather than trying to bring all that data back to a centralized location. And it's much more cost effective. And then the way that we index the data, and then the way that we license is just much more cost efficient. And then we're doing some really cool things about storage that I'll talk about a little bit later.
And the reason why this is important for not just agencies, but also mission owners and industry, but also the users, is it makes search better. It makes the ability to drive decisions, operationalize, just to use that terminology, the data easier and better. And we're seeing that. You mentioned CDM, dashboard is a good example.
Yeah.
Is when you talk about this operationalization of data, maybe explain to me a little bit about why this approach is so helpful to make better use of data.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the whole idea of operationalizing data at scale to support a mission outcome, again, whether it's improved cybersecurity posture, improved threat hunting, improved healthcare outcomes, right? The more data that you can get into that environment and access and normalize, the better your results are, right? The better the outcomes are, because the more data that you bring into your decision-making process, the better your decisions are going to be on the other end. But in addition to that, if you are trying to implement a better decision-making process and analytics process across all of the Department of Defense, the Navy's got its own data store, the Army's got its own data store, the Air Force. So, how can you query all of that data in a common way, right, in a common framework, and be able to garner results across that entire environment? And again, in public sector, that's a real need. If you look at Health and Human Services and all the operatives within Health and Human Services, how can you have a unified data strategy again in that environment? And that's one of the things that we can do at Elastic.
And I'll even go one step further. It's not just all the data stores in DoD or HHS, it's all the data stores across government, because as you're seeing more and more, and we saw this over the last, every time there's an emergency, a pandemic, any sort of effort, it's not just one agency responding, it's HHS with CDC and FDA. It's
right.
Okay, we also need DoD with the Defense Production Act, and we also need the White House, and then that's driving that ability to say, okay, we're querying that data all in, again, as you said, one approach.
Yeah, and again, like the CDM dashboard or the JRSS dashboards are perfect examples, right? You've got 200 civilian agencies that feed information to that CDM dashboard. You can't replicate all that data and bring it back to a centralized location. You need to be able to search that data out at the edge and then just bring the relevant information back. Same with JRSS, right? You've got these massive amounts of data flowing through those joint regional security stacks, and you want to provide that dashboard and threat analytics. You can't expect to bring all that data back to a centralized location. It just doesn't work. And we're talking a lot about security, but that applies to everything else, right? AI operations or any data analytics search function. We are increasingly doing more with government agencies too, around the executive order around improving customer experience. There's a lot that we can do to improve interaction with government websites, and leveraging things like large language models and ChatGPT to make data more accessible to the citizenry. So there's just a lot of cool stuff that we see coming there as well.
You almost got through the entire first segment without mentioning ChatGPT, so almost congratulations there, or you're getting booed on the other end. It's one of the two. Yeah. We're going to talk about AI, because I think that's really the key piece here. When we talk data, a lot of this will evolve into AI. But let me just ask you, you brought up this idea of you can't replicate your data places. Is that what was maybe the biggest challenge early on, even before cloud, or even at the early stages of when agencies were getting the cloud, they were trying to replicate their data too much? Because you always hear, well, if you don't control your data costs in the cloud, they could go off the charts. Yeah,
moving data in and out of the cloud environments is very expensive. And again, not to make this all about Elastic, but with M2131, right? And if you look at Log4j or the SolarWinds vulnerability, we had to go back years and be able to look at that data. A lot of that data was in long-term storage, where that data had to be rehydrated and searched, and it took weeks or months to be able to search that. And one of the things that we've done now at Elastic is we index the data before we put it in that long-term storage. So you're able to search that even in long-term storage in a matter of minutes rather than days or weeks, and now you don't have to rehydrate it. But again, we are able to index and search that data where that data sits rather than trying to replicate everything and bring it back to a centralized location. So yes, to answer your question, I think the idea that you had to say, hey, we're going to put all our data here, we're going to bring everything in, and then you start to realize the cost and the inefficiency of that because of the storage challenges, some of the things I just mentioned, and you can't necessarily put all of your data into a centralized location. So then you have to leave some of the data out, and then again, when you're trying to search data across agency, it gets really difficult to do that.
I don't think I've ever heard the term rehydrate your data. Now I'm just going to think of that for
excellent
adding your water to mix it up. Chris, we're getting close to the break before, and then we're going to jump into the AI discussion. You mentioned early on this idea of structured and unstructured data, and for years we've been talking about the challenges of really unstructured data. There's been push by the Office of Management Budget, Congress, whomever you want to point to say, you got to know what your data is. Is this idea that of, again, breaking down the silos, bringing the search to the data, is that another way to deal with this challenge of unstructured data?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are some real advantages of having a structured data environment in terms of, how you query that data and the batch processing and all that. But there's a lot of data that we deal with that's unstructured. I mean, log data, for the most part, is unstructured real-time data. So if you're a threat analyst in a security environment, you can't worry about searching your data in a structured environment and doing batch processing on data that's been sitting there for some period of time. You need to be able to work in real time with unstructured data. So yes, having platforms that can ingest both structured and unstructured data and be able to apply analytics to that data in real time, there are some, again, from a cyber analyst standpoint, that's a necessity. That's not a nice to have, that's a must have.
And I think that's part of the issue. You mentioned CDM. Again, I'll just tag back to that. It's the dashboard has been something that CISA has definitely celebrated. The fact that they use the dashboard in most of the recent cyber events that we've seen that have affected Log4j, you mentioned as one example. Just give me a sense of what's that CDM dashboard look like today a little bit, and how is it being used by CISA and agencies?
Yeah, there was a really cool article that just came out, it was just the past week, that talked about how the new CDM dashboard is functioning in the way that it was always envisioned to function, and being able to, again, do this analysis and remediation in real time and identify threats proactively rather than reactively and do some proactive remediation. So I won't be able to do it justice. I'd point everybody to that article and read the article, but yeah, they're doing some really cool things with that.
Well, you're kind enough not to mention where it came from, but I'll just give some credit to my colleague Justin Doubleday, because I think he broke that story. So if people want to find the article, they can find it on federalnewsnetwork.com. Shameless plug. Chris, we're just hitting a break. Before we do that, let me just maybe open the door a little bit. The reason why we're talking about data, and the reason why, beyond the fact data is the new oil, it's really because you have to have good data, you have to have clean data, and you have to know where your data is to really start using these emerging technologies. Just give us a little bit of a tease about why the data now is maybe more important than ever. And we know why, but as we talk more about AI and the like.
Yeah, if you look at the mission of government or private sector for that matter, the role that data can play in advancing the mission of government, whether, I talked about some of this earlier, whether it's better enabling the warfighter on the battlefield or healthcare outcomes. I mean, you hear about how we are now using, and I mean, that was always the holy grail. I used to do a lot of work with the VA, is how can you mine all of this data with 26 million veterans? How do you mine that healthcare data to deliver better outcomes, to be able to provide better diagnoses and be able to provide better treatment, to be able to get people in a better state of healthcare, using data, right? And now the tools exist to be able to really start to do that. So I think everybody has realized what the promise of data was. It was just, how do we, as you said, Jason, how do you operationalize the data? How do you clean the data? How do you access the data to make it usable to be able to execute things like, the mission of government, improve citizen service delivery. And now with the AI tools that sit on top of that, we don't have enough data scientists, right? We need more data scientists to be able to do the analysis of the data and make the data usable. But gosh, you start to overlay things like the large language models and generative AI on top of these data sets, it really makes the data so much more accessible to everybody.
We're going to talk a lot more about why it's so important. We can talk about AI a little bit when we come back from the break. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Chris Townsend, the Vice President of U.S. Public Sector Sales at Elastic. Chris, before break, I teased a lot about AI. Let's jump right in about the use of AI. You got to have good data. You got to clean your data. You got to know where your data is, because that's really going to make your tools that you use for that data, the analytics AI, better. Let's just talk a little bit about that use of AI. What are you starting to see? How can agencies really start to take advantage?
All of the agencies are trying to figure out how to use generative AI or large language models, again, in advance of the mission. It's a really exciting time. I believe in it. Obviously everyone's talking about ChatGPT and LLMs and generative AI and how it's going to really change the way that we work with data and we interface with our IT systems. And I think all of the agencies are doing a lot of research now and putting together working groups and trying to figure out how to leverage this technology. And we're certainly seeing that at Elastic in a whole range of cases. So Elastic is a vector search database, right? So I don't want to get too in the weeds technically, but essentially these LLMs and generative AI, they're designed to run on top of a vector search database. And if you think about what ChatGPT does or any of the LLMs, when you do a search for information, in the past it was keyword based. Now they provide meaning. They look for context in the meaning of what you're asking the tools. And you think about how powerful that is, why everybody's so excited about that technology. You're asking these AI models a question and they are putting your question in context and assigning meaning to that question. So the information that you get back is so much more relevant, and then the way that they deliver the information is so much more relevant. So there's huge application across all of government and much of what we do, and we're working on a lot of stuff around that.
I know there's several agencies that actually put out policies that have tried to slow down the use of generative AI. When you talk to agency customers, what's the feeling you get? Do they have a lot of questions but no answers? They're looking for answers when it comes to kind of, okay, can I apply this type of technology? How do I do it best? How do I protect both my mission area but also the citizens?
Yeah, I was just out at the EDGE conference in San Diego a couple weeks ago, and that was a big topic of conversation throughout the discussion. I think everyone is obviously trying to understand how to best use that technology in a secure way, right? And again, that's shameless plug for Elastic, but that's one of the things that we can really bring to using LLMs and generative AI within a public sector environment. We do have these security controls that we can implement in terms of RBOC and privacy and all that. So figuring out how to put some bounds around that so you don't unintentionally start to access PII data or sensitive data, classified data is really important. But I also think that the agencies recognize the tremendous potential benefit of being able to access data to do things like improving security posture, doing threat hunting and cybersecurity, or to providing better access to the citizenry, around the executive order of improving customer experience. So tons of applications. We're just scratching the surface in the applications of these technologies.
You mentioned threat hunting, cyber. Maybe we should jump into that area too, because that's another big area. We've talked a lot about automation for years when it comes to cybersecurity. The excitement was around AI. It sounds like, just based on what you're saying, there's maybe more of a reality, less excitement, meaning looking forward, it could happen now. How can, for instance, different AI tools really improve an agency cyber posture?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about AI in a couple of different ways as it applies to cybersecurity. So we've been using machine learning and AI in our detection engines for years within the Elastic platform. And one of the really cool things is we started out as open source, so our ML and detection engines are open, and we allow our threat analysts to be able to make changes to those detection engines and the way they work and customize them for their environment. But the idea of those detection engines are to allow them to be more proactive in identifying threats, right? So hey, this hasn't been identified as a threat, but it's acting like a threat, it looks like a threat, right? So AI and ML can play a real role there, and they can also help our analysts scale more effectively. So, and we've been doing that for years. Very important tech and a really differentiator in some of the things we do at Elastic. Now, LLMs and generative AI play a different role, right? You think about the DoD and how they rotate folks through their security operations environment, right, every 3 years, and you're bringing in a lot of new folks on a regular basis, and you want to get them up to speed as soon as possible, right, and allow them to be more capable. With an LLM, you can have a natural language search of a potential vulnerability or a threat, or use the LLM to query about how to remediate a threat, and really shorten the time to making new analysts effective, right? And improving their ramp time, if you will, to be more effective at their role and be able to remediate threats more effectively. So again, if you think about the power of LLMs and how it makes data more accessible to everyone, it applies to security as well.
The one thing I think people lose sight of is kind of this idea of, okay, I can ask the ChatGPT, the generative AI LLM a question and understand, okay, what did I miss? Or as you said, new people come in. That can also be done for people, okay, how do I understand what the threat is, how it works?
That's right.
I think there's a lot of benefits there. Are you starting to see some agencies apply these technologies, or is it still too early? Are we still in the early stages?
No, we're absolutely seeing agencies apply those technologies to exactly what you said. So to understand what the threat is, what the potential impact is, what the remediation is. We've actually built in an AI assistant using these into our SIM platform already. So it's available through our SIM platform.
We talked a little bit of cyber. Are there other areas within the government that you would say these type of models, this type of AI technology can also benefit? Again, understanding that there's still some concern, understanding that there's a lot of questions about it, but there's some immediate kind of, we'll call it the low-hanging fruit of generative AI.
Yeah, I haven't talked with anyone in the VA or DHA about this in particular, but I've been reading a lot of articles recently about the potential impact of LLMs and GPT or GI in a healthcare environment, right? So to help a physician provide a faster, more accurate diagnosis of complex healthcare issues. So I think the potential of this technology in government is, like I said, we're just scratching the surface.
And I think that's why there's so much both excitement about it.
Yeah.
You can't go to a conference, as you said, without hearing people talk about it. But at the same time, there's also, okay, well, how do we use it? How do we protect against it? The other piece of this is, okay, we've talked a lot about the government's data. They have a lot of data, but there's also a lot of public data that they could use it against. Is there a balance that they're trying to strike? Is this maybe better for public data right now since it's public data?
Yeah, and again, I keep feeling like I'm doing a commercial for Elastic, but one of the really cool things that we're doing, Jason, is these large language models are trained on public data. And we've got private data in the government that we don't want to necessarily expose to the public environment, but yet we want to use the power of these LLMs. Elastic can take the contextual question from the LLM and access securely private data and use the contextual question from the LLM to provide a response just from the data at that government agency, right, that we've exposed to Elastic. So if you think about what the LLM does, on the front end, it gives us a really easy way to query the data. On the back end, it explains the data in a very digestible way for a human. And in between, where do they get that answers to that information? We can be that answer to the information. So we can reach back into a government agency and securely, in a controlled way, provide that data back to the LLM to get a response without taking confidential data and putting it out into the public environment.
Is there a way to filter through that to say, okay, this potentially could have a social security number? Or...
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. So we have filters down to field level and on documents and information. So we can do that today, but yes, absolutely. And we could provide role-based access control, so you can segment the data that you're accessing, so you're not accessing the entire data store. So there's all kinds of cool field control level data that field control that we could do around the data so that we're not accidentally sharing something that wasn't intended.
I remember years ago, the whole concept, and you probably will laugh at this a little bit, is the mosaic effect. Well, if I bring a little bit from you and a little bit from here, all of a sudden I'll learn something that maybe I shouldn't know. Does that come up at all anymore? Is that even a concern or have we gotten past that?
Yeah, I think
broad-based?
I think that's a very real concern right now. At that conference I was at a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of discussion around private LLMs, right? So training LLM models within just a private environment to prevent that commingling of public data with private data. And I think you'll see some of the agencies that are very security conscious probably move in that direction, but still use the technology, but just use it in a more limited data set.
Right. More controlled, I think, as well, where they know what's happening and how the application's happening. Chris, I want to go one last thing in the few minutes we have left. agencies are on their data journey. As I talked about earlier, the federal data strategy is almost more than 4 years old now. We've been talking about data, I want to say, since like 2008, when this idea of the data is the new oil started to pop up. What can they do to kind of really start to take advantage of this, of not just AI tools, but more take advantage of that data to operationalize it better, faster, more easily?
Yeah. So all agencies have been working since the data strategy was published to figure out how to better operationalize and use their data. And there's a lot of companies out there that have popped up to help with that in a lot of different areas. And I think we're starting to see a lot of convergence and building more cohesive agency-wide data strategies. I think we saw the use of data in pockets, and if you had an operations group over here that was doing fraud detection, they may be indexing and using their data for something over here. The cybersecurity folks may be using it. The customer experience folks may be using it. But now agencies are looking to, hey, what should we be doing agency-wide, enterprise-wide in terms of our data strategy? What tools should we be consolidating out? Why are we indexing and our data over and over, duplicating our data, paying for multiple storage solutions, paying for multiple tools to index the same data repeatedly? So I think we're seeing a lot of consolidation around data and seeing a lot of consolidation of the tool sets so that they can buy one tool set and be able to use multiple. You think everybody wants to be a platform, right? We talk about what a data platform is, but really implement a data platform with multiple third-party solutions that can sit on top of that platform that can use that data in different ways.
I think your point about breaking down the silos, which we talked about earlier, and understanding from an enterprise-wide perspective is really being driven both from the data strategy and as well as the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. I think everyone kind of likes to blame Congress a little bit for too many laws or not the right laws. Here's a couple ideas that are really driving this change. For agency customers, is there something that they're doing maybe time and again that you're like, okay, if you can avoid trying to bite the apple and eat the apple in one bite type of idea.
And I think the agencies are really moving in this direction. Most agencies now have a chief data science officer that are looking at the data strategy holistically across the agency. But yes, most customers that I talk to, especially in the C-level where they're CISOs or chief information officers, are the cost of managing their data have become untenable. So it's, hey, how do we continue to operationalize this data to support the mission, but do it in a really cost-effective, more efficient way? And I guess what I would say is the pothole to avoid is stop buying all the shiny object tools and kind of taking a step back. We went through this, I've been in cybersecurity for a long time. We went through the same thing in cybersecurity, right? Every shiny object tool that popped up, we'd buy those, we'd put them out. In some cases, it was necessary because that's the way that the threats were evolving. But we saw a real kind of step back on the cybersecurity side and say, okay, how do we build an integrated security model and start to reduce our costs and tool sprawl and be more operationally efficient? I think we're seeing that same evolution right now in data.
All right, well, you and I will continue to talk about this because this is a hot topic for sure, but unfortunately we're out of time for today, so let me thank my guest. Chris Townsend is the Vice President of U.S. Public Sector Sales at Elastic. Chris, always a pleasure to catch up.
Thanks for your time, Jason. Really appreciate it as always.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.